All right, so today we're diving into something a little different, a little unexpected. We've got this pairing of the Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, which is this like a really intense psychological look at this woman kind of coming apart at the seams, and then we're putting it up against the Law of One, this teachings that supposedly came from an extraterrestrial being named Ra.
Yeah,
In fact,
it's like apples and cosmic oranges or something like that. What could these two possibly have in common? But that's what I love about these deep dives. We get to dig into these seemingly totally different worlds and find those hidden threads, those unexpected connections. What do you think? What jumps out at you with this pairing?
Well, I think what really excites me is the chance to explore these like fundamental parts of being human, right? Like perception, how we see the world, the idea of feeling trapped both physically and mentally, and then the nature of the self. And we're seeing it all through these two totally different lenses. Like on one hand, you've got this very personal, almost claustrophobic journey into a single mind going through this intense breakdown. And then you've got this massive cosmological perspective on like the very fabric of existence itself. It's a pretty wild mix.
Right. It is. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to try to make sense of it all, extract those key insights about consciousness and how we perceive reality and what it even means to be a self as these sources present it. So we're going to be looking at themes of confinement, that feeling of being trapped in the power of the mind, but also how fragile it can be. And then those different ways we can journey towards self-discovery or maybe even self-destruction, like in the case of the narrator in the Yellow Wallpaper. But she's not exactly finding herself in a happy way.
No, not exactly. But that's what makes her story so compelling, right? And that's where I think we can start to see some of those initial connections between these two sources. They both grapple with this idea that our perception of reality, what we think is real and true, might actually be really limited or even totally distorted.
Okay, so let's dig into that idea of confinement and how it impacts our perception.
Mm.
In the Yellow Wallpaper, it's like you're right there in that room with the narrator. You feel the walls closing in. You experience her world shrinking down to just this oppressive yellow wallpaper. And then her perception just starts to get warped, right? She becomes fixated on those patterns. She sees a figure trapped behind the paper. She feels like she's being watched. It's so powerful how this limited environment really messes with her mind.
Yeah.
And then you've got that constant image of her trying to peel away the wallpaper. It's like she's desperately trying to claw her way out of this mental prison she's built for herself.
And what's so interesting is that the Law of One also talks about limitations in our perceived reality, but on this completely different scale. It introduces this concept of illusion, the idea that what we experience every day is actually a kind of construct that we collectively agree on. Ra calls it a shared illusion that we inhabit at our current level of consciousness, which they call third density, the density of self-awareness.
So it's like in the Yellow Wallpaper. The confinement is coming from the outside, right? It's a product of her specific social situation, her marriage, her role as a woman in that society. But with the Law of One, it's suggesting that this illusion is like a fundamental part of our existence at this stage of our spiritual evolution. I don't know, am I getting that right? It seems like both are saying there's more to reality than what we're currently seeing.
You're exactly right. And what's even more interesting is that Rai specifically mentions that many people at this time are seeking outside their illusion. They're looking for something more, something deeper. And if you think about the narrator in the Yellow Wallpaper, her obsession with the wallpaper and those desperate attempts to tear it down could be seen as her own way of seeking outside of her confined and distorted reality. It's like the wallpaper becomes the symbol of the illusion itself. All those constraints, her stifled creativity, the way her mind is trapped.
Wow, I never thought of it that way. But is it really the same kind of seeking? I mean, the narrator is driven by desperation, by her mental state unraveling. It's not exactly a conscious choice to find greater understanding like the kind of seeking described in the Law of One, right?
That's a really great point. The motivation and the outcome are definitely different. But I think that underlying impulse, that feeling that there's something more to reality than what's right in front of us, that seems to connect both scenarios. The narrator senses this hidden reality within the wallpaper, even if her interpretation of it becomes completely, pathological.
That makes a lot of sense. And the Law of One also talks about how our physical senses, what we can see, hear, touch, all of that, and actually gives us a really limited view of reality. Yeah. And that obviously creates all sorts of biases in our understanding. So when you think about the narrator, again, she's completely isolated, right? She's not allowed to engage in any kind of meaningful activity. She can't write. She can't really interact with anyone except her husband and her brother, who's also her doctor. I mean, it's no wonder her perceptions are so skewed. She's basically being sensory deprived.
Exactly. It's like her mind is starved for stimulation for genuine interaction. So it starts creating its own reality within the confines of that room. And the wallpaper becomes this focal point, the center of this increasingly bizarre inner world she's building. Yeah.
Yeah, the less she's allowed to experience the real world, the more real those patterns on the wallpaper become for her. Okay, so we've talked about confinement and perception. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the nature of consciousness and the self. This is where things get even more interesting, I think, because now we're dealing with these completely different frameworks for understanding what it means to be a conscious being.
You're absolutely right. And the Law of One introduces this really fascinating concept called the mind-body-spirit complex, and talks about how this complex evolved through different levels of consciousness that they call densities. Could you maybe break down what those densities represent, in the context of our discussion about perception?
Yeah, so basically Randry describes this sort of progression, right? So the first density is like the most basic level of awareness. It's the consciousness of being found in things like minerals and water. And then you move up to second density, which is about movement and growth. Think about plants and animals. And then we get to third density, which is where humanity currently hangs out. This is the density of self-consciousness, where we develop our individual egos, and then it goes even higher. There's fourth density, which is all about love, understanding, and harmony. And Earth is supposedly transitioning into fourth density right now. And there are even densities beyond that. So it's like this grand cosmic ladder of consciousness.
Exactly. And each density represents a different way of interacting with and understanding reality. So in third density, with all this emphasis on the individual self, there's this inherent sense of separation from everything else. And that limits our perception, right? It creates this kind of tunnel vision. But as we move towards fourth density, the idea is that we start to break down those barriers and experience a more unified consciousness. We start to see those illusions for what they are.
Okay, so that's the model from the Law of One. But how does that compare to what's happening to the narrator in the Yellow Wallpaper? I mean, her experience of self seems to be going in the complete opposite direction.
You hit the nail on the head. Instead of expanding her awareness and feeling more connected to the world around her, the narrator is experiencing this tragic fragmentation of her sense of self. She becomes increasingly fixated on that figure she sees in the wallpaper. And it's like she starts to merge with it. Her own identity, her sense of I dissolves as she falls deeper into this mental breakdown. It's a really powerful example of how external forces and those internal psychological pressures can completely shatter our sense of self. That same sense of self that the Law of One says is so characteristic of our current density.
Yeah, it's like two sides of the same coin, right? On one hand, you have this idea of the self expanding towards unity, and on the other hand, you have this total collapse inward under all this pressure.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about how fragile we are,
Yeah.
how easily that sense of who we are can be broken.
And there's this other really interesting concept in the Law of One that I think could apply here. It's the idea of wanderers. These are entities from higher densities who choose to incarnate on third density planets like Earth to help with the evolutionary process. And while it's obviously not explicitly stated in the Yellow Wallpaper, it does raise this question. Could the narrator, with all her suffering and those uniquely distorted perceptions, be seen as someone whose true nature just doesn't fit into the limitations of her current reality? Like maybe she's a wanderer who's just deeply uncomfortable and out of place in this world.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. It's like she's so fundamentally at odds with her environment that her mind just can't cope. The Law of One also talks about the importance of balancing our energy centers, or chakras. And it says the blockages in these centers can really mess with our mind-body-spirit complex. Do you think we could apply that concept to the narrator's situation? I mean, she's clearly described as having this nervous condition, and she's under a lot of emotional stress. Could that be seen as a sign of these energy imbalances within her own system?
Absolutely. Even though it's not directly addressed in the Yellow Wallpaper, it's definitely a valid interpretation through the lens of the Law of One. It brings in this idea that her inner harmony is disrupted, which could be contributing to her mental decline.
Yeah, and when you think about the power dynamics in her relationship with John, her husband, it's like pouring gasoline on that fire. He's the doctor, so he has all this power over her. And he's constantly dismissing her feelings, her perceptions, her need to be creative. It's like he's trying to control her mind and body.
And what's really striking about that dynamic is how it completely contradicts the emphasis on free will in the Law of One. Ray talks about free will as a primal distortion, meaning it's like a fundamental principle of existence. And the Confederation, which is this group of beings that Ra belongs to, they have this really strict rule about respecting free will. They only offer help when it's specifically requested. They call it waiting for the calling. So this whole idea of one person trying to control another person's reality, like John's doing to the narrator, it goes against everything the Law of One stands for.
It is really hard to read about how he treats her. It's like he's trying to force her into this box of what he thinks a wife should be. And it's clear that his controlling behavior is a big part of what drives her over the edge.
Absolutely. And while the Confederation in the Law of One is all about service and helping others, there is another group mentioned called the Orion Group. And their whole thing is conquest and enslavement. So even though John's intentions are different, maybe he really thinks he's doing what's best for his wife, there's this disturbing echo of this negative polarity that Ra describes this idea of one entity trying to dominate another's experience of reality.
It's chilling when you think about it that way. Okay, so we've talked about confinement perception, the self-power dynamics. Now let's dive into the symbolism, which is something I always love to dissect. The yellow wallpaper is overflowing with it. What about you? What did you pick up on with the symbolism?
Well, the yellow wallpaper itself is obviously the biggest one, right? I mean, it's right there in the title. But how did you interpret its significance?
Oh man, so many layers to unpack with that wallpaper. First off, it obviously represents her confinement. She's literally stuck in that room. But it also represents the societal expectations placed on her as a woman. It's like those expectations are the walls of her mental prison. And then that yellow color, I've always seen it as symbolizing illness or decay, like a jaundiced soul. And those patterns, those maddening, intricate patterns, they seem to mirror the tangled and contradictory rules that women were expected to live by. And then there's that figure she sees trapped behind the wallpaper. It's like her own stifled creativity, her desire for freedom, her true self trying to break free. It's all right there in that wallpaper.
And that's what makes it such a powerful symbol, right? It's both literal and metaphorical. It's the room and it's her mind. And speaking of symbolism, the Law of One also uses symbolic frameworks, but on this much grander scale, right? So those different densities of consciousness can be seen as symbolic representations of the different stages in the evolution of consciousness, different levels of understanding and interacting with reality. Each density has its own unique set of characteristics and lessons.
So like the wallpaper is this really personal and immediate symbol for the narrator's internal and external struggles. And then the densities in the Law of One are these more abstract, overarching symbols representing this universal journey of consciousness.
Exactly. And there's this one little detail in the Law of One that really struck me. It talks about spiraling energy in the context of the Great Pyramid and how it was used for healing and initiation. And it made me wonder if the narrator's obsession with those swirling patterns in the wallpaper could be seen as this distorted manifestation of a deeper yearning. Maybe she's unconsciously seeking understanding or release or even some kind of spiritual connection. It's a bit of a stretch, I know.
But that image of spiraling energy pops up in both sources, which I thought was really interesting.
It's like the wallpaper becomes her way of trying to grasp at something beyond her immediate reality, even though it's ultimately leading her down this path of self-destruction. So both sources are dealing with this theme of seeking, but in such different ways.
Right. And as we talked about earlier, the narrator's seeking is driven by this desperation, by her mental state deteriorating. It's not this conscious choice to find greater understanding like the kind of seeking that Ra describes. It's more like this frantic grasping at straws. Yeah, it's very inward focused and ultimately self-destructive. Whereas the Law of One explicitly talks about seeking outside of our limited perception. It talks about individuals who are actively trying to understand reality and their place in it. And Ra says that recognizing that we don't have all the answers that we don't fully understand is actually necessary for what they call harvestability, which basically means being ready to move to a higher density of consciousness.
It's like saying that admitting what we don't know is a crucial step towards growth, which makes me think about the narrator's journey. I mean, it ends with her having a complete mental breakdown. So how does that fit into this idea of seeking? Is it like a failed or distorted attempt at understanding?
That's a good question. I mean, she does eventually realize the truth about her confinement and the nature of the figure in the wallpaper. But it's all filtered through this lens of psychosis. It's like she peels back the layers, but what she finds is this warped reality created by her own fractured mind.
It's like a dark reflection of the conscious and intentional seeking that the Law of One describes.
Right.
They both involve uncovering a hidden layer, but the methods and the outcomes are completely different. One leads to madness, the other leads to greater awareness. And the Law of One also emphasizes practices like meditation and selfless service as ways to access the original thought, which is this fundamental principle of unity. And that's so far removed from the enforced idleness and self-absorption that the narrator is forced to endure.
It's like those two paths couldn't be more different.
And finally, I think it's worth mentioning the role of the observer in both of these sources because it ties into everything we've been talking about. In the Yellow Wallpaper, the narrator becomes this incredibly meticulous observer of her surroundings. She spends all day scrutinizing that wallpaper, the colors, the patterns, the way the light changes on it. It becomes her whole world. And in the Law of One, they talk about developing mental disciplines. And one of those disciplines involves observing the geographical and geometrical relationships and ratios of the mind, the other mind, the mass mind, and the infinite mind. And it's presented as a way to achieve this much broader and more interconnected understanding of consciousness and reality.
So once again, we see this stark contrast. The narrator's observation becomes incredibly narrow and subjective. It's all focused on her immediate environment and her deteriorating mental state. But the Law of One is advocating for a much more expansive and interconnected way of observing that encompasses all levels of consciousness.
Exactly. It's like one is a descent into a self-created limited reality through this obsessive observation, and the other is a path towards greater understanding through this expansive and interconnected awareness.
So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've gone from the suffocating confines of the Yellow Wallpaper to the vast cosmology of the Law of One. And I have to say, it's amazing how many unexpected connections we've found. It's a testament to the power of these deep dives, you know?
Yeah.
Even though these sources are so different in form and origin, they both offer these really profound insights into how we perceive reality, what it means to be conscious, and how our sense of self can be so vulnerable.
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is this reminder that we all have our own wallpaper, those ingrained beliefs and those societal structures that subtly shape how we see the world. And it's a call to question those limitations, to look beyond them, to seek a deeper understanding. Like the seekers in the Law of One were all invited to explore beyond those boundaries.
That's such a good point. And if we take the Law of One seriously and accept that our everyday experience is actually a form of illusion, then who knows how many layers there are to peel back? What might we discover about ourselves and the universe if we keep asking questions and keep seeking deeper truths? It's something to keep pondering long after we sign off today. That's for sure.
I completely agree. It's a journey that never really ends.
And that's what makes it so exciting. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a mind bender as always.
My pleasure. These conversations are always so stimulating.
Until next time, keep seeking.
And keep questioning.